How's it going, everyone? So, before we dive into the episode, I really want to say thank you to everyone that is listening in, that's tuning in, that's enjoying this content and getting value from it. I really love that. That's why I do it. But there's a huge amount of you that are listening that are not subscribed, not following the podcast. And I really want to encourage you to please follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening or viewing this on. It really helps out the podcast. It helps out the algorithm. It helps more people hear this content that you already find helpful and that they hopefully will as well. So if you go ahead and subscribe or follow the podcast on any platform that you're listening on, and please share it with your friends, that'll be great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's get into the episode. How's it going, Fayon? It's really great to finally get you on the podcast. I think that we've been probably working towards this thing since probably the end of 2023 is when I got the email initially, but I'm glad that we're finally able to get together.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I start everyone off with telling their background. The reason why I do that, is because there's a portion of my audience that are trying to get into cybersecurity or they're trying to get into IT, and maybe they even went to college in something that wasn't IT related, and they're in a career path that they don't like right now, and they're trying to make a switch, right? And I have found that it was always very helpful for me when I was trying to make that jump into IT and into security myself to hear someone with a similar experience or a similar background, um, you know, and they were able to pull it off. And so then it's kind of like in your subconscious, like, well, if they could do it, maybe I can do it. Right. So,
Yeah.
how did you get into IT? How did you get into security? Was there something earlier on in your life that kind of sparked that interest?
I think like most people that I know, I got into the cybersecurity space I kind of just fell into it, I would say. So my background is I have my undergraduate in mathematics. In undergrad, I did a dual degree program, so it's a 3-3. Well, at the time it was a 3-2. So I had to have a bachelor's in math, and then I transferred to a partner school to get engineering degree. I thought I was going to be a mechanical engineer. So that's the second major I did. I went into mechanical engineer. It turns out I didn't like it. My dad was pushing me to do electrical engineering. It's like, I don't want to be like you because my dad's also, he's a computer scientist, a computer engineer. I was like, I don't want to be like you. I want to create my own path. And so while I was going to school, my sorority sister, she was like, hey, do you want to work at this company? And so I applied and I got a position to be a breach assistant. And in that role, I worked with a breach team. So this is at insurance company. And I work with attorneys or individuals with attorney background, legal background. So they're coming from the cyber data privacy space. And I also work with the technical folks. So with like their CISP and stuff. And I was just breach assistant at the time. So I get to see a different lens of it where at that time I didn't know much about cybersecurity, I would say. I thought it was, the stereotype, like a guy behind a computer hacking people every day. So it was a different exposure. It was insurance. It was more on the reactive side. So it was the breach response team. So when an organization would be impacted by a cyber incident, the team, they would be sort of like an on-demand breach consultants. So they would get on a call with them and sort of they're dealing with a crisis. So they would potentially just help them walk through what that would look like. So getting all the necessary vendors they need to sort of mitigate that. So that was my first time in that space, and I've been there ever since. That was 2017, six years ago,
Okay.
about. So I've been there since. I have since left that company, and I'm now with Corbis, where I do instead of the reactive, I do a bit more proactive work. So I'm with the risk advisory team, and our team is it would provide resources to our policyholders to prevent the severity and likelihood of a cyber incident. So being that I've seen like, okay, what it's like on the back end of, helping organizations after they've been impacted by a cyber incident. Now I'm like, okay, let's figure out how to avoid that from happening. So we offer a ton of services. So I've been there since. That's how it started. I honestly thought I was going to be a mechanical engineer, but now I'm a cybersecurity advisor. I've been with Corvus since 2022. I'm now a senior cybersecurity advisor, so I've definitely advanced in my role over the time. And even at my prior company, I started as a breach assistant. You know, I expressed interest in like, this is kind of cool. I want to learn more. And so, you know, on that team, when there was a position that opened, that was my opportunity to step into more of the breach response role to help these organizations when they have a cyber incident. Yeah.
So, so it sounded like you kind of just dove into the deep end, right? And I'm sure along with that comes a lot of anxiety, right? And like imposter syndrome and things like that, right? Like you know, I've been in cybersecurity for probably 10 years, and when I get a new role, yeah, I still have imposter syndrome to some degree. I'm like, I hired the wrong guy. Obviously, they didn't think that I would be like this or anything like that. You know, any day now they're gonna tell me I'm gone. You know, did
Yeah.
you experience any of that? And if so, how did you overcome it? Because I'm sure that that's a pretty unique situation, right? Like, not everyone jumps into the deep end in cybersecurity. I I don't even recommend it, right? When people are asking me how to get into security, I tell them to go a different path than that. So how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I still suffer from imposter syndrome today, but I think a large number of it's for me to help me overcome this is with the leadership on my team. At my prior company, training was really good, and I thought I couldn't do it because I'm not technical enough. I mean, I know a bit of coding because you know, uh, some of my background. And I also didn't mention this that I started to do my master's while I was doing that role
Mm,
in computer science, but the focus would be on cybersecurity. And so I have some knowledge of what to expect, but I'm a very visual, hands-on learner, so I needed that. But I would say most of my peers, they were really good with helping me and training me. And I ask a ton of questions. I'm very inquisitive. So that definitely helped. But I'd say the key to it is leadership in on my team. But I still to this day struggle with imposter syndrome. Like I'm like, okay, am I do I know it? You know, I get on calls with or organization or policyholders to talk through like gaps that they could potentially have in their security posture. It's like, okay, I have to brace myself. It depends on who's on this call. Sometimes you're getting the very technical folks, and sometimes you're getting someone from like risk management. So it really depends on who you're getting with that conversation, how that conversation could end. I think most of them are pretty positive, but I still struggle with that today. Therapy is like definitely a working process for for me.
yeah, definitely. You know, it's interesting just being in the cybersecurity realm. The amount of people and the different kinds of people with different backgrounds that you're encountering on a day-to-day basis, it's always very important to understand who's on the call, right, and what their background is, what their role is, what they're working on. There's been numerous times where I didn't understand that earlier on in my career, and I approached a problem from a completely incorrect angle, and you know, almost like burned a bridge before like even putting it up. It's an interesting balance though, because you know, security tends to touch every department in the company.
Yes.
Like, we don't just work with developers or other IT people. Like, we have to work with the legal team and say, no, it needs to be this way because of this. And, you know, we need to work with procurement people and people that are doing audits and everything under the sun. It's an interesting, you know, place to be because, you know, not only is security growing and changing every single day, you know, you also need to really be on top of your communication skills. And I think that that's like a it's like an undervalued skill that as technical people we don't always put that emphasis on.
Yeah, I agree. I would say like even with security, I can say it's a pretty diverse industry, right? Like you mentioned, we need to touch on every topic in across an organization, like every department gets to see something security related. And I would say that, again, back to that stereotype of who you would imagine to be in cybersecurity, not as someone that looks like me with my background, where, and you think of someone who's technical, you don't think that soft skill is they're mostly like computer coding or hacking or doing something like that. But that soft skill, that communication piece is definitely something that I think helped me in my role. Uh, Categorize myself as an introvert. I don't know that most people see me as that. I think with that though, I still try to think through like, okay, how do I communicate with the different people speaking that language? Trying to translate something that's very technical to a very non-technical, depending on my audience.
Yeah, I mean, I try to consider myself an introvert as well, but then here I have this podcast, so I don't think I can make that claim anymore.
Yeah, people tell me I don't think you're an introvert. I was like, I think I am.
You just to backpedal just a little bit, you got your degree in mathematics, started to go down the mechanical engineering route. What was that like to do the mental gymnastics to make the pivot in IT, right? Because I'm sure that there must have been something where it's like, well, that's not really what I've wanted to do, right? That's not what I set out my goal to be at the end of this thing. How did you kind of reconcile that, I guess, within yourself? And the reason why I ask is because it actually took me a long time to do that myself. I got my bachelor's in criminal justice, fully expected to go into federal law enforcement. I thought this IT thing would be a very temporary thing, just something to pay the bills until I get into an agency somewhere, because they take like 1 to 2 years to get you in. And I can't be without an income for 1 to 2 years when I have student loans, right? And like it took me a long time. I mean, like I was in IT, I was in security, and I was still, trying to angle myself and get into federal law enforcement, right? That was that was everything to me. That was my dream. And now looking back on it, I'm actually thankful that it didn't work out, right? Because I don't have to put my life on the line every day. I'm not worried about, these random, life or death situations. I get to, sit safely in my house and not go outside for a week if I don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's the same thing for me. Like I said, I was working part-time while going to school full-time, and I worked at the bank, and I hated working at the bank because I had to sell, and I was like, that's not my personality at all. And so when this opportunity opened up, it was just like, okay, I'll continue to go to school while I try to make some money to pay bills. But it just became very interesting, and I wouldn't consider myself very technical. So for my approach to it was more of like, oh my gosh, there's this other side of the world that I don't get to see every day or hear about all the time. You're hearing about companies that's getting hacked. What is ransomware? At the time, ransomware was like, it wasn't as big as it is today. But you hear about all these things, or like in the healthcare space, especially, I didn't understand the different policies and regulations that they have to abide by. But seeing that was like, it was, to me, it was not boring at all. So it was like, there's never a boring day. This is so interesting. You learn something new all the time. And then you get to talk to like people who are experts in the space, because I started off as like a breach assistant before I became like a breach manager. I got to sit in the background and listen to my colleagues on calls, or talk to like forensic vendors or law firms about what's going on, to understand the cyber threat landscape. I was like, okay, this is actually kind of cool, and I'm helping people. So I don't mind doing this. And so that's when I made the switch, because I was like, okay, I could switch and study something else, because at this time, I feel like, okay, I will get to learn more of the theoretical piece while I'm getting the more real life experience of it. So
Mm.
that's that. So similar to you, I was just trying to pay bills, and then here I am, almost 7 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating field. One of the first people I mentored, right? He was trying to get into cybersecurity from being in the networking. In my opinion, networking is probably like the worst part of IT. It's the most boring topic in the world. I tried to, get my network plus early on in my career, and the only thing that book did for me was put me to sleep at night, like, or even at work. Like, that was the most embarrassing thing. I hate networking. I just hate thinking about it, right? Which is weird for a security professional to say, but it's like, I truly do not care what protocol, you're using. Is it encrypted? If not, we need to talk about it, right? Like, that's the extent that I care about it. Um, I was talking with him and I was describing what it's like in cybersecurity. And he was mostly on board until I got to the point where I said, but you have to be comfortable with always learning, always something changing, and you needing to learn something new and adapt. That was the part that really like stopped it right there for him. Was like, well, I don't think that this is it, because I kind of want to just like get my CCNA and stop there. I'll be good for the rest of my career. I don't need to go to school or get certs or anything else like that. And I'm like, well, you're going to stagnate, right? I later on in my career, I met people that had been in that same exact situation where they chose to no longer, learn the new stuff. They chose to no longer, learn the new technologies, or, the different protocols or reasonings, best practices. They chose to stop doing all of that stuff. And later on, actually fairly recently, they were laid off. And now they're having trouble finding work because they don't have those skills. The skills that they had were for that one company. And that one company, his manager really liked him because he was a funny guy. So the manager always did a good job of making sure that they had that role, that kind of workflow for him, so that he could say to management, like, hey, this is the only guy that does it. He's the only guy that knows how to do it. God forbid the day came when, someone said, well, can't we do it another way? Right. And he didn't have anything to back it up. And immediately my friend is now, on the job market, which is, it's an interesting time to be on the job market, especially when you're trying to like rebuild your skills. I would not want to be in that situation. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I like, well, one, I like his honesty, like knowing like, who he is. Like, yeah, I don't think I want to learn anything else. And so that is interesting. But yeah, the job market, it's pretty rough right now. I know a few people that are trying to get into the cyberspace, and they asked about like what should they do, and similar background to mine. I explained to them, I think most of it is networking. I think with cybersecurity, a lot of the roles sometimes, mostly the non-technical ones, it's very transferable skills from what you're doing. Like if you're a fast learner, that's one. And if you're able to communicate well, like we just talked about, that's also key. And just being curious and willing to expand your knowledge. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting time to be unemployed.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like one of those key skills that are often overlooked for security professionals is that communication effect. Like, I remember when I was on help desk, and maybe it was just the company that I was at and the business that we were in, right? But we were dealing with like 911 software that directs calls, and provides exact location information to the first responders. And I mean, I would get calls sometimes that were just like, hair's on fire. This thing isn't working. Like, I gotta get the whole team on here to figure it out, right? So I was used to being in like high stress situations and calming people down, talking them through it. And I dealt with like the military, the federal government, right? So like, they can't do a screen share. They can't send you logs, right? Like, you literally, and they intentionally do this. They intentionally put someone that literally doesn't know how to spell Linux on the other end of the call for you to work with them. And that's not an insult to them in any way, right? They actually, they are extremely intelligent and smart in the one thing that they do for that agency, and it is very intentional for the agency to do that. And it is also very intentional for them to put them on the phone with you, because they want to know liability if something goes wrong. They want it to be like, well, this vendor doesn't know,
Yeah.
that's literally the situation. I mean, you're getting on the call with these guys that you can't see anything, you can't get sent anything, and you have to walk them through, exactly what to type on the keyboard. That sort of skill is now that I'm looking back on it, it's an extremely valuable skill. Like that's why I tell everyone, start in help desk, because if you get through a stressful environment in help desk, that's all the communication stuff out of the way right there.
Yeah. Yeah, that is super key. I would say like even in my last role at the prior company I was with, where I was like that on-demand breach consultant, you're getting a call from someone who's like, our entire system is down, or company's losing money. What do I do? So they're in full crisis mode, and sometimes they're not happy in them having to call, their insurance carrier and talk to someone and like answering all these questions, especially if it's someone who's not technical, right? They want you to figure it out, or they're upset. I've had a lot of interesting interactions with C suites who are experiencing like a ransomware and how to handle that. And you have to be really calm and patient with most of these people because one, you have to understand that they're dealing with something they probably never had to experience. The fact that their company is losing a lot of money, the fact that someone's saying, "Hey, you gotta pay me millions to get your stuff back." So yeah, it definitely is a unique skill set, to say the least.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was on the help desk side of it, right? Like I think that my customers could tell that I was, very young, very early on, still learning things. I mean, I'm still learning today, but I definitely know a lot more than I did
Yeah.
then. And it was always interesting when, you would get the more senior person, the more senior. I mean, this always happened with guys. The more senior guy that knew significantly more, than you about everything, and you give them advice, and it's like it doesn't land, it doesn't make sense to them because they don't know the intricacies of your system. I remember, for instance, I was working with a very large bank. If I named them, and 2/3 of the world would know who they are. And I was working with this person, and I said, okay, your database is out of memory. We have to increase the memory. It's not a server issue. You already have the memory on the server. We just need to expand the database because it doesn't know to utilize it, right? And so that's why we're running into all these issues. And it took probably 4 hours of convincing them to do it. And like, guys, I literally like this is what it is. My engineers have confirmed it. My developers have confirmed it. The people that literally created this application confirmed that that's what's going on. They got very vocal with me, very unprofessional,
Mhm.
and that was frustrating for me. It was definitely a learning
Yeah.
experience, but like at the same time, it was a situation where it's like, hey, like this is what it is. I don't know how else to explain it to you. Right? Did you run into situations like that where, people kind of like almost give like a sec?
Yeah, all the time. And I'm a woman, so that's just like an immediate, you know, um, like it moves me down in terms of like them, assuming my expertise. And then the next thing would be like, I'm a Black woman. We don't see a lot of Black women in this space. In my current role, I'm definitely getting on video calls with these organizations, and most times you're seeing male, right? Especially if it's the technical side of the organization that's hopping on these calls to talk about any recommendations that I could have. And that's where like my imposter syndrome would kick in, right? It's like, okay, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, and then I have an accent from Jamaica. I was born in Jamaica. So
Mm.
sometimes you can hear it come out. It's like, oh my gosh, all right, now I have to, present myself in a very stern way to make sure like what I'm saying it holds some value. We don't see a lot of women, let alone like minority women in or women of color in the cyberspace. I mean, I think it's changing now. Like, from when I first graduated undergrad, they said it was about 10% women in cybersecurity. Now we're at about 25% of women in cybersecurity, but only 9% of that is, women of color. So I'm not getting on calls and I'm not seeing people that look like me all the time. So definitely experience that, I would say, quite a bit, especially if it's someone who's very technical and, I'm making a recommendation of like, hey, you probably need to do this because your attack surface is too large. Let's shut this down. Let's move away from this and implement this control and that. I get quite a bit of pushback often, but I have to stay diligent. I have to stay like be firm in these calls, and sometimes it's like I don't know what else I can do, but I'll still offer you the recommendation and I hope you take my recommendation, and because it's really not for me. It's for you and your organization to essentially save money at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's I don't understand how people can be like that. To be completely honest with you, I've led teams before, and I mean, I led one team where I think probably 10 out of 12 on the team were women, right? And
Yeah.
I encountered stuff like that all the time because we would be so strapped for time, I wouldn't be able to attend every single meeting, to make sure that our projects are on time and acting with the developer community and, whoever, needed to be on the call, right? And so I would send obviously one of my 12 people to this meeting, and we would go over the topic of the call, what you need to address. Here's the most common questions you're probably going to get. This is how I would want it, to be answered, because most of the people on the team, yeah, probably almost all of the people on the team were fresh out of college, learning just like I was at one point in time. And so I try to make it as less stressful as possible, right? I try to eliminate a lot of the unknowns that they may have in their head to make them feel more comfortable in the call, like they're prepared going into it. You know, there was so many times where they would just be discounted, right, for saying the exact right thing, and they are younger women, and people are just like completely just not accepting their opinion, right? And there's been countless times when I would have to meet with this person, the do that, and like after a couple times of doing that, I think most of the teams, opened up a little bit more to the realization that like this critical, application is run by a team that's mostly women, right? But they're led by someone that knows what they're doing. Like I feel like they had to like understand the situation just a little bit better and get used to it, which still it's really dumb, right?
Yeah.
For me, from an engineering perspective, right? If someone says something that I don't understand on a call or makes a recommendation that I don't understand, as an engineer, I'm working backwards. I'm trying to say, okay, well, how did they come to that conclusion? How does it make sense? Does it make sense? Am I the dumb one here and I'm not seeing something, and I'll ask questions like, hey, what were you thinking when you recommended that, when you said that, right? Because I don't know. I think as an engineer, it's really important for us to always have that open mind, because as soon as we no longer have that open mind, we really hold ourselves back.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely have to be unbiased. And I really like that you advocate for your team. I think that's super important, especially for like women in the industry. Like I think just IT itself is like, majority is super male dominated. And then we don't see a lot of women, even though that's changing now. But I always say for me, my experience was a little different. Um in both my roles in the space. I've had women as leaders, and these were like super strong women. So that was really good for me, for my experience. I know that everyone experience is the same. The other thing is they advocate for me, right? So my leaders now they try to make sure I get the visibility as a thought leader. Like I know my stuff. I'm like I said, I'm an introvert, so I tend to shy to the background. But for them, they're like, yeah, you're smart. You know your stuff. People need to know that you know your stuff. And as a woman of color, also people need to see that there's representation across the board. So they definitely advocate for me. So I really appreciate you doing that for your team because that is super important, like advancing that women of color, women in the space, and also like sort of bridging that gap.
Yeah, so sometimes I feel like I'm like too defensive. It's
Oh,
just like how I was like brought up. Like I will, be very blunt with people, and a lot of people don't appreciate that. But at the end of the day, it's like I'm sorry, I just don't care. Like you were wrong in doing this. I'm going to go to bat for my team because I've been in situations where like my leads didn't do that for me, and like I was in the right and I just needed someone that was more senior than me to say like, hey, he was right. And for whatever reason, for whatever selfish, self-promoting reasons, they decided not to do that. And so like I've experienced the other end of it, obviously not as a woman or anything like that, right? I'm a white male, like I can't experience, two-thirds of what the issues that you just mentioned, right? Just I've seen the other end of it, and I wish more people would take ownership like that, right? Because I read Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership book, and I think that it's a really good book for anyone to really learn how to be a leader. If anything fails on my team, if anything goes right or wrong, it's all because of me. And guess what? When it goes right, and I'm not the one that actually did it, the credit doesn't go to me. It should be directed towards that person.
yeah,
Even if I'm in the room and my boss's boss gives me the credit, it's like no, it goes to this person over here. Like they handled it through and through. And it's interesting to see those principles at work because I like when I read something, I really try to consume it and understand it and impact from there. Is that also true potentially with you? Like, have you read different books that have impacted like how you address different situations in the workplace?
so I would say, um, books. I'm more of a podcaster, so I love
Okay.
to listen to podcasts. Most of my podcasts, with different speakers or different guests on these different shows that talk about, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what is for women, talking about like how to handle like microaggression. So that's what helped me. Like, okay, let me see. Okay, how do I handle certain situations? And then I lean heavily on like mentors to help me with offer like guidance on how to approach different situations.
So to I guess to maybe circle back to an extent, right? Let's talk about what a breach analyst is, because I've actually never heard, that title, that position, or anything like that, right? I don't know the entire insurance. I've never been
Yeah.
at a company while it was breached, and I never had to make any of those calls. So, like, what is that like?
Yeah, so for my previous role as a breach, the title, which title versus like what you do on a day-to-day basis is pretty interesting, but it was a breach response manager, and in that role, um, we would insurance company. So we're, they when you have a auto is claim, you call your auto insurance saying, "Hey, this is what happened," and they'll probably recommend, I don't know, like you need a tow truck or something. From the commercial side, it's someone is experiencing a cyber incident. Most times they don't know how to, mitigate or remediate. They reach out to us. We'll hop on a call with them and say, okay, we ask a few questions, get to the nitty gritty of what they're experiencing. If we can offer immediate recommendations, we will do that. But we'll also recommend third party services. So, usually, let's say ransomware is an example. If someone's experiencing a ransomware, we'll offer immediate recommendations. And then we'll say, hey, you need to get a forensic firm who, for those that's listening that is not familiar with what a forensic vendor does, is their goal in like an incident like this is to determine how and what. So how did something happen and what did this bad actor get to? And then for legal counsel, it would be for, the legal side of it, making sure that the work is being done under attorney-client privilege. and then also assist with most of the communication for those heavily regulated industry, making sure that you're, dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So that's our role, and we will walk with them through the entire process. So that was the core of that role. With that comes other day to days, and even today with my current role, I talk to policyholders like in insurance. You have to do an application. With that application, you have to meet certain controls or requirements. Those requirements look like: do you have like MFA for email? What's your backup strategy like? So if you meet those requirements, you're essentially a decent risk or a good risk for this insurance company to write a underwrite. So my job is to, one, help the underwriters on the internal front analyze these responses from application. Is this sufficient enough for us? And from the external side, we if it doesn't meet it, a company will say, "Hey, I want to talk to a cybersecurity advisor, myself or one of my colleagues, to talk through where is the gap and how can we close that gap to make sure we have a pretty robust security posture." That's the core piece of my role today. But I do tabletop exercises, which I really enjoy doing those. And then we do like incident response plan reviews. We have like an in-house threat intel team, and with our company, we have a scan. So we scan the parameter based on domain, and we identify any potential risk that they could have. So it's really, again, risk prevention services. I would say like it, that my current role falls in the bucket of. My previous role, breach response services, would be like breach coaches. I think that's more generic term.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Hmm. I never thought of that from like a breach perspective, right? Going to one singular person and them, kind of directing everything, right? I mean, we have that with incident managers and whatnot,
Right.
at like larger firms, where, you if you're the one that's leading the technical side of it, you just tell that incident manager whatever you want, and it's their job to just deliver it, which is, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because from an executive perspective, or an upper management perspective, I want to call one person, and that one person just, you know handles the legal engagement, handles all this other stuff. It's like, just send me what I need to sign, and I'll sign it.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, from the insurance side of it, more towards your current role, I've heard recently that companies are kind of, they're I guess they're weighing the insurance recommendations against like the cost of deploying those controls versus the cost of the policy, because now this is only from what I've heard, right? Like, I haven't like read articles on it or anything like that, but people were saying that the insurance premiums were going, you know, so like sky high, that it doesn't make sense to deploy the security recommendations that require you to get the policy. Is that something that you've encountered, or is that something that is like kind of made up?
Yeah, I haven't encountered that. I will say, in comparison to premium, with the cost of like a claim, significantly different,
Right.
right? Because I think with threat actors, like there's no bias, right? If there's someone who they can target, they're going to target them. And insurance premium varies based on a number of factors. So small mom and pop shop could still get hit with a ransomware whose ransom demand is $1 million, and they probably paid what, $5,000 in premium. So the weight of that, and in order to not get a $1 million ransom demand, is to have the appropriate like controls that the insurance carrier is recommending.
Mm.
I think I would like for people to think of it like we're hoping that everyone wins. It's a win-win scenario. It's protecting you because it's not just the cost of like paying a ransom demand. It's a lot more that goes into it. We have to hire people to do the work. That's legal, forensic. If you have to pay the ransom demand, you need ransom negotiators. And then you have to look at the back end of it. If you have to notify people, which is super expensive. Like, I think of a large firm who maybe handles a ton of personal information, they may have notification obligation under different state laws. And so they have to send out notification letters, which can be pretty pricey. And then you have litigation on the back end after everything is done. So it can be super expensive.
Where do you see the insurance industry with cybersecurity going, right? Do you see it kind of maybe even crossing over into, the private sector, right? Where, me as an individual can go to a company and get cybersecurity insurance against, a breach of data or something like that. Like where do you see that going? I mean, maybe it's my own ignorance, right? I'm not in the insurance side of it. I don't deal with anyone on the insurance side of it ever outside of my podcast. So it sounds like that's a pretty expansive area.
It
To
is.
me, it feels like, okay, this is only going to grow.
I agree. It is definitely only going to grow. I think cybersecurity awareness itself is growing. I think that helps with sole proprietorship or a small business become like, okay, maybe I should be doing something. And I think I've seen cases where like a small doctor's office, like a one person or two people, they are starting to get at cyber keys. It could be embedded into another type of insurance, and it's just like an added coverage within that. So like if this happens, then I have these services available and this coverage. So yeah, I see it growing rapidly, actually.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Like I always tell people, whoever I'm close with that comes to me for this sort of advice, right? Where we're talking about insurance coverages and whatnot. I always tell them to go with the more expensive route, right? The better solution that's covering more. The reason, so like I told you before the show, right? My audience knows I have a 1 year old at home, right? Well,
Yeah.
when she was born, I only got to hold her for 10 minutes and then she was taken from me and she's in the NICU and now, she's in a life or death situation. I mean, that was by far, it's not even close. That's the hardest situation I've ever gone through in my entire life.
Oh,
The last thing I ever wanted to think about was insurance coverage. Or is this bag of morphine covered? Like, I did not want to think about that. I didn't want to do the math. I actually couldn't think about it. I actually couldn't do the math. I had people ask me my name and I couldn't tell them my name. That's just the amount of stress that I was under. And when it's literally your worst day, your worst situation, you want to just be able to make one phone call and be like, hey, handle this. I need to engage the policy, whatever it is, right? Same thing with like car insurance. On my birthday this year, someone decided to sideswipe my Audi and it didn't look that expensive. I figured, okay, $2,000 to $3,000. This is fine. It was literally parked outside of a restaurant, at the back of the parking lot. No one else was around it. I came out, no other cars were around it, and someone just sideswiped the car. Take it to the body shop. Oh, 15 grand. Like, okay. Well, a lot of insurances would fight me, on that, right? But I'm
yeah.
taking it to a place that I know is reputable that's going to make the car look, perfect, like it never even happened, which, truly to me, like that's what I want. I don't want to drive around in a car that's all banged up and stuff. And, it's not fun. I like that car,
Yeah.
and it was one call to the insurance and they're like, okay, that's expensive, but we're going to take care of it. Like that's what I want to
Yes.
hear. And
Yes.
so it's interesting. It's interesting where the insurance side of it is going to go because maybe that'll go or,
Yeah.
whoever that's like, hey, we also have this cybersecurity insurance for 10 extra dollars a month.
I see the potential of it growing there. Like I've talked to companies where it's maybe like 4 employees that work there. They don't even have a brick and mortar. Everyone's virtually working. But I think based on the line of business, right, they still need to have these proper cybersecurity best practices in place just to protect themselves, just to protect their customers or clients or whoever they're working with. Because I think today data is like gold mine, right? Like you get it. It's really critical information. So protecting that data piece is super, super important. Yeah, sometimes I'll get on calls and say, well, we don't have any data, or we don't have this, or we don't have that. I'm like, technically you do. You have employees. Yeah, well, that's important information. So you probably want to protect your employee information because, as we can see in terms of the privacy world, like different states are becoming really, really strict with how companies or retail providers protect customers or consumer data. So yeah, I think it's gonna keep growing.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up, still that logic kind of like persists in the world where I don't have any data. What are they going to target me for? Admittedly, I did not have that great of like network security at my apartment at the time because it's an apartment
Yeah.
building a house, right? I'm going to have it at the house. There's no need for me to have it here. And on my podcast, this is very much a free flow podcast, right? And when Russia built up, their forces on the border of Ukraine
Oh,
in November of what was it, like 2021 or whatever it might have been, right? I started saying like, yeah, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. Like there's no doubt about it in my mind. This is why they're gonna do it. This is why I think it. All that sort of stuff, right? At that time, my content was served in Russia. I would get, a percentage of my overall traffic would come from Russia, um, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that or anything like that. As soon as they invaded, the content gets blacklisted in Russia and China and all of their allies. And not only is it blacklisted, but now I'm getting like very weird targeted attacks. And I'm sitting
okay.
here like, okay, like it's a nation state actor, right? So if they want to get in, but out of my own like self-conscious, right? I have to at least make it a little hard. So it's like, okay, fine, I'll get this whole like tech stack in here. And I don't have any data. I'm a security person and I'm saying it. I don't have any data. I don't have anything for them to take, right? Um, but at the same time, what about this personal document that you
Yes.
have, right, that you don't even think that you have anymore, but you have it and it's there, and if they get it they could potentially steal your identity, right? Like, do you want to take that risk?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Not just like the data, but like what could they do to your website? What could
Yeah,
it do to your reputation, which also could result into some financial loss for businesses. So it's a really interesting conversation when someone says, "Well, we don't have anything to protect," or "We don't do anything that would require these controls." So, like, technically, yes. Loss of revenue is never good. So in any way you want to protect it. And that's where I would say for companies, how can they, be proactive with this is do a bit of risk assessment. Understand what are the risks that you have and then sort of build your controls around that.
yeah. Well, and we're the top of our time here, and I personally I feel like we go for another hour or two,
Yeah.
but that typically just means I have to have you back on sometime in the future. But before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they could find you if they wanted to reach out and connect, and where they could find your company if they wanted to learn more.
Yeah, so they can connect with me on LinkedIn. So it's Fayon Atkinson on LinkedIn. I'm not very active. I have a yearly 24 goal to like be more active on LinkedIn. But due to this, I will make it a point to get on LinkedIn more often. But yeah, I work for Corvus. It's now a traveler's company. So cyber insurance for all organization, business sizes. They can always reach out to my team. We are the risk advisory team at Corvus. So we offer risk prevention services. We have a website, so it's corvusinsurance.com. We have a ton of resources. We have webinars that we teach about like cybersecurity. We have threat intel data, so it's at corvusinsurance.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode or watching it, whatever platform you're on.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, Joe. I had a
Yeah,
great time.
yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed our conversation. All right. Well, thanks everyone.